It was a victory for women everywhere. I had really realized that when I won, and I got so many letters from other Muslim women. And more than that, from women within my own country who felt that it was now decent to work. I don't know why, it's a strange thing to say today, but in those days, people thought that it was indecent for a woman to work, and good women, in inverted commas, didn't work. It was a very strange world of divisions. And it liberated women. They said, if the prime minister is a woman, why can't we work? I remember being told a story about a lady who wanted to be a pilot and went for an interview. And the chairman, who happened to be from the armed forces, laughed and said, come back to me when we have a woman prime minister. Well, she did, and she got the job. And now there are more women pilots too. Well, it's in life, there are challenges, but I think leadership is very much predicated on the capacity to absorb defeat and overcome it. Now, after having been in politics for more than 2 decades, I have come to the strong conclusion that the difference between somebody who succeeds and somebody who fails is the ability to absorb a setback. Because on the road to success, there will be setbacks. And there are those who give up and those who say that no, we're going to go on. So it's that capacity to absorb a failure. And then I also, when I was in prison, I became very devout. I'm not a fundamentalist, but I am very devout. And I believe that God places a burden on one's shoulders that he feels that you can bear. So in a sense, when the burden grows heavy, I turn to God and say, oh God, don't let it be so heavy that I cannot put up with it. So I would say that in solitary confinement, when I had nobody to turn to, see, I was brought up ritualistically religious as everybody is. Their parents take them to church or teach them how to say their prayers like my mother taught me. That it's all ritualistic. It was when I was in prison and everyone was cut off from me, my family, my friends, food. We even couldn't get a glass of water without having to beg somebody for it who came twice a day with my food. No ice. I mean, the ordinary things in the heat of the summer where you can open a fridge and take nothing. I had nothing. They took everything away. Material, physical, everything. And suddenly I realized they can take everyone away. I couldn't read newspapers. They wouldn't give me newspapers or Time magazine. So suddenly I realized, but they can't take God away from me. So to pass the time, I started passing it in prayer. So from that moment, I realized that God is always with one. So what gave me the faith and the sustenance was my belief that God places a burden on people to bear. And he places only that burden which they can bear. The second was the love of ordinary people. The love was so much that it was enriching. It gave me strength, nurturance, nourishment. Maybe I'm a needy person. Maybe I need love. Because sometimes I think, why would someone go on doing it? But when I get so much love, I feel that at the mass level, that I feel I must go on. So I think that those are the two factors that really kept me going, because in the worst of my moments, I always had vast reservoirs of love. I remember when I was overthrown in 97, and things were very bad in the press. They were calling us all sorts of names. And the first time, you're spoiled as prime minister, you have your own planes to go in and everything like that. You don't catch passenger planes or go through the security checks. The first time I caught a plane and was reintroduced to the real world, the air hostess saw me and she hugged me. And she said that, it was during your time that my brother got a job and changed our family's life. Then I remember that when I reached the Karachi, I was going home, the whole union had gathered. And the whole union received me and they threw rose petals all over me. So suddenly I thought, I'm not alone, even if the press, the government, everything was after me. That was my agenda. First, I did it for democracy, as I said, because that was my father's. It was also mine, but it was my agenda as a youth. But my own agenda was very much poverty alleviation. And it was population planning, for instance. We brought down the population growth rate by 1/3. And because of the cascading effect, it's going to continue going downwards. And there was a lot of hue and cry against the population program, but we did it by recruiting 50,000 women from different villages and training them in 3-month installment. First, they were trained for 3 months. They'd go out and work. Then every month, they'd come back for a refresher to learn something more. So when we had 50,000 women with a vested stake in it, we had ambassadors everywhere to counter people in villages who were opposed to population. I remember we iodized salt, and the cleric said you shouldn't eat iodized salt because it's got really population control in it, and you won't be able to have any children. So we did take on an agenda that frightened the status quo and the people who believed in the status quo and who actually believed in a patriarchal society, in a tribal patriarchal society, because to a great extent there is still an undercurrent of a patriarchal society in Pakistan. Well, there'll always be critics. They say in politics there'll be the appointed and the disappointed. So there'll always be the critics. One has to take it. I learned that after my first election. I thought all I have to do is win an election and all my critics will disappear, and according to Barbara Cartland, will live happily ever after. But I realized that the day you wake up later, your critics are still around and you still have to factor them in. And my experience has made me a more inclusive person, not inclusive to the margins, but inclusive to those people who have differences with us, but who are still moderates. So I try to be more inclusive. It's not easy because the other side has to respond too. But ultimately, there will be critics, but one has to do what is right, as long as the majority of people support that. Building schools was right. I tried to placate even the clerics originally. I adopted a very aggressive, I thought I had to prove I was as tough as a man, because I was in a man's world. It was supposed to be a man's world. Now I think it's not a man's world anymore, but in those days. So because it was to be in the man's world, I also tried to be very aggressive and more mongering in my second term to try and co-opt. I am a consensus sort of person. I like to win people over, a co-opt or compromise, not the core of my values, but I seek the middle way. And I tried to do that, but I think in retrospect it was wrong because I did not co-opt them and I alienated some of my own supporters. But at the same time, we got the 3 years to eliminate polio, to build schools and electrify villages. And now I feel that if in 1977 politics was a man's world, now it's a human's world. And that when people vote for women, they vote because they think women are more nurturing, that they give life, they produce children, and they give life, and they vote to be nurtured. As the larger issues of communism and capitalism fade away, the focus, in my view, is turning more and more to the human being. And in this, with more perhaps women coming into the workforce or into the press, there is a sense that women leaders are turned to because they will be sensitive to the needs of mother and child. When I meet a young woman student and I ask her, what do you want to be? She says, Prime Minister. I was so surprised, I've come across so many women who want to be Prime Minister. So I'm sure that there are lots and lots of young girls out there who one day can be Prime Minister. But I think we need to also make it easier for women to win elections in Pakistan. And that's why we've proposed affirmative action, a kind of list system where on the basis of votes that each party gets, they can then list about 25% to 33% women to bring more women into parliament. But certainly there are women activists, not too many. Still the base in terms of women who can win elections to parliament is too small. But former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif's wife has also started politicking, which is really a vindication for us because they used to be very much against women coming out into the political field. But on the younger students, the people like when I was Prime Minister who were at university in their first year, second year, third year of university, those are the women who think that to be successful means to be Prime Minister of the country. You ask a man what he wants to be, he'll turn around and say a businessman or a lawyer. But the girl students that I talked to all wanted to be Prime Minister. So I think that within that generation that grew up in the last decade used to seeing me as Prime Minister, as leader of the opposition, seeing after my election Hasina Wajid winning in Bangladesh and Mrs. Zia and Mrs. Chilla in Turkey, other Muslim countries. This has had an impact on the Muslim world. In Oman, now they've started having women parliamentarians, and I think they're permitting them in local elections or something in Kuwait or Bahrain, one of the Middle East countries. So it's when I first got elected, I mean, they said that a woman has usurped a man's place, that she should be killed, she should be assassinated, she's committed heresy. So from going from heresy to seeing it happen, and part of it is the information world, because it brings down what's happening in the rest of the world to ordinary women in parts of the Muslim world. And they say, why not us? "1953. It was a very different world then, very few motor cars, and much more poverty. The gap between the rich and the poor was greater too. I remember people walking barefoot and bare-backed because of the poverty. It was a very privileged life that we led, with huge homes and scores of staff, with everything looked after. Now the world has changed much more. There's a greater appreciation of each human being being equal and entitled to the same opportunity, as well as emphasis on human dignity. In those days, there was much less dignity. I remember that the poorer people would greet the richer people by bending down and touching their feet or prostrating them and throwing themselves on the feet. So it was a totally different kind of world, and it's changed for the better in that sense. My father was always championing the cause of the poor. He was very much against the status quo. So he was always telling us that it's wrong that there should be people in such abject poverty, unable to feed their children. I mean, I'd be sitting there when women would come to my mother and say, take our children, we can't feed them. My father was a lawyer. I remember him coming back and saying that a man came and said, I don't have any money to pay you for this case, some murder case he'd been involved in. And he said, take my cow because I don't have any money. And that was the cow that would give the milk to feed the children. So it was quite shocking to me, and I was sensitive to it because my father was sensitive to it. And he'd take us, we were landowners, large landowners, and he'd take us to the lands. And he would tell me, look at the way these people sweat in the heat and in the sun in the fields. And it is because of their sweat that you will have the opportunity to be educated. And you have a debt to these people because they weren't born to sweat like this. And you have a debt, and you've got to come back and pay that debt by serving your people. Now, when I look back on it, it was my father who was against the gender constraints of my time. And my mother, she used to be a working woman herself. She joined the National Guards. She was a captain in the National Guards. She was the first woman in Karachi to own a car and to drive. And people used to talk about her because they said, women aren't supposed to drive cars. But when I look back on it, it was my mother who thought that a woman grew up to be married and to have children. And she would tell my father in front of me, why do you want to educate her? No man will want to marry her. So all the time, for her success depended on having a good catch as a husband and having children. Whereas for my father, he broke free of those constraints. And he insisted that I have an education. He said, boys and girls are equal. I want my daughter to have the same opportunities. I just assumed this is what fathers did as children do. And when I finished university, he was in prison, and then he was unjustly hanged by a military dictator. And now in reflection, I would like to ask him and say, what made you do things differently? Although I'd go to other people's homes, and I remember a friend of mine, they couldn't eat food till the brothers had finished, and the leftovers would be given to the daughters. That never happened in our home. I remember that I used to sit at the head of the table because I was the eldest child. That never happened in other homes, and I should have asked my father when I had the chance. But he enabled me to appreciate that a woman is not a lesser creature. And also my nuns. I used to go to a convent of Jesus and Mary. And I remember very much Mother Eugene, who used to teach us literature. and poetry, and reach for the moon and the lodestar, and inspiring us. It was very inspirational and motivational that one could conquer the moon and the stars if one reached out. So it was all about reaching out. I think the two powerful influences in my life, in my childhood, was my father and was my teacher in the Convent of Jesus and Mary, Mother Eugene. I was fascinated with literature. My father gave me a love for books. He loved reading books, and he'd make sure that I bought books, and he'd buy me books. And then Mother Eugene made my imagination run wild through Shakespeare and Twelfth Night and Julius Caesar and Keats and Browning, Byron. It was mostly about people who were achievers. My father was himself an achiever, and maybe it was a time of achievers. I grew up at a time when colonialism had just ended, and the whole inspiration behind colonialism had been to discover the world and to achieve more. There was a sense of adventure, going to unmapped places, braving beasts of unknown description to conquer the world. So it was very much still within that phase when words were more grandiose and expressions were more grandiose and the imagination was more grandiose. Now things are much leaner and meaner. I was a good student. My father put a great emphasis on education, and I found that he would always be so pleased when I did well. But it was terrible for my siblings because they were always being compared by the teachers to me, and they would revolt against it because I'd have a neat handwriting. It's awful now, but right then it was neat, and I'd get my work done and finish everything. I was very studious. I was very, very studious. I had a love for learning. The others didn't like to sit down and do their homework, but I loved doing it. I was the eldest. And I had a great sense of responsibility. When my parents would leave the house, they'd tell me, take care of the other kids. And here I'd be like 3, and my younger sister would be 1, but I still remember, take care of the kids. And I remember once we came to England, and I think I was about 4. My younger sister was 2. And they used to have these gas pipes. And I was always a very curious child, and they told me, don't touch those pipes. And I went and touched them and opened it up, and my parents came back just in time because I nearly poisoned the whole household. So I learned not to be too curious after that. When I was a very young child, I remember I was always against violence. It was an era when people used to go shooting and hunting. And I remember once coming out on the veranda in our home in the countryside, and my father was teaching my brother to shoot a parrot. And I remember seeing the parrot fall down dead and bleed. And I remember being appalled by it. And I remember the parrot fluttering. And I can't bear to see blood to this day or killing. And I'm very much against war and conflict and the taking of life. And I think that seeing that little bird, green and beautiful and living and chirping in the tree, and then falling down dead, did have a profound effect. It sounds silly to say that one should feel so strongly about a bird, but I remember my father telling me when he was facing the death sentence that I remember the little girl who cried so much because a bird died, how she must feel. So for me, human life is very, very sacred. The other thing I remember is that this man had come to our home. He was a fisherman, and he used to fish from the sea nearby, and he used to sell us the fish, and he felt very ill. So my mother took him. He was again shoeless and backless. And my mother took him inside the house and said, what do you want or whatever to make him feel better. And I remember he wanted a Coca-Cola. Now everybody drinks Coke, but in those days it was difficult to get a Coke, and that was his wish. And he was very sick, and my mother wanted to send him to the doctor. And I remember he didn't want to go to the doctor. He was clinging to the car. And I always felt after that perhaps people need to have their dignity and to die in peace, rather than to be taken to strange clinics. So I feel a great empathy now when there's a rediscovering of the way of how people should be allowed to pass away. I've had many traumatic deaths in my life, and perhaps that has given me more sensitivity to the need to take leave amongst one's loved ones to begin the journey to the next world, because I believe there is a next world, than to let it just end in a clinical room. It came gradually. It was not a sudden, there were two moments, let us say, when it happened. You see, one of the moments was when my father died. And before he died, I had my last meeting with him in the death cell. And he said that you have suffered so much. I had been imprisoned myself. And he said, you're so young. You just finished your university. You came back. You had your whole life. And look at the terror under which you have lived. So he said, I set you free. Why don't you go and live in London or Paris or Switzerland or Washington, and you're well taken care of, and have some happiness because you have seen too much suffering. And I reached out through the prison bars, and I remember grasping his hands and saying, no, Papa, I will continue the struggle that you began for democracy. And so that was one of the points where I decided that I didn't want out. I'd stay back. But I still didn't think I'd ever be prime minister. I thought my mother would be the prime minister and that I'd work for her to be the prime minister. And that's what I did. But my mother got sick. And actually, she had lung cancer, but we didn't know she was getting Alzheimer's. So she started behaving differently, and we thought it's because she's had this serious illness and she's reflecting on how to lead her life. And suddenly I found that since mommy was away and the whole party was about to collapse unless I was there, so I started looking after the party at that stage. And when I went back, I remember people were shouting, Prime Minister Benazir. And suddenly it struck me that looking after means, mummy ill, looking after means that I will be the Prime Minister. So it was in that sort of moment when I realized that the responsibility that I had taken over could lead me all the way to an office that could govern the destiny of more than 100 million Muslims of Pakistan. I think the most profound influence in my formative years was the years I spent at Harvard. I went there at a time of great social ferment, at a time when the Vietnam War was being fought. I, as an Asian, was against the Vietnam War. But I found that my American fellow students were against that war too. And they didn't want to fight the war. And they were protesting it. And I found that if you didn't like something, you could do something about it. It was also a time when Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King and idealism, Chavez, I mean, the great boycott from California, labor's rights. So I was very much into saving the world. My generation grew up in saving the world. We thought education wasn't important, exams weren't important, although I still did it because I was scared my father would get cross. But I discovered that life was more than my homeworks and my tuitions and my tutorial. Life was about the larger issues where we could all play a role. And the women's movement had just started. Kate Millett had just written her book. All the discussions that we'd have over there about us women, that which of us women would succeed. And I remember a very dear friend of mine in college years who I hardly seen since, Wendy Lesser. She's taking out a literary magazine now in California, the last I heard. But we'd sit there having these intense conversations about women's succeeding. And could they succeed? Could they break the barriers? Because at that time, still many women thought that their objective in life was to go on and be married and not so much to have a career. So I was very much influenced by my formative years. It was the time of President Nixon's impeachment and McGovern running. And, Massachusetts was the only state that voted for McGovern, so it showed how idealistic we were compared to the rest of the world. Recycling newspapers that go around trying to recycle newspapers. And I see a bit of that age come back in the sense of the environmental issues which are getting important, but less in issues of sacrificing yourself for the larger community. Now I think it's more an age of the individual comes first. Then it was more an age that we as an individual subordinate ourselves to the larger communal good. I saw the power of democracy. It was really, I felt powerful. I felt my voice counted. And meantime, in Pakistan, my father had been trying to empower the ordinary Pakistanis and telling them that they could break free of the shackles of feudalism and military-industrial complex. So when I went back, my own experience put me a bit ahead because I'd had a broader experience. I'd had experience in Pakistan and in America, and I'd seen it succeed. So I went back really at the right time. I didn't have doubts. Somehow, I didn't have any doubt somehow or the other for me because my father was so important. He thought a woman could succeed, and he would tell me that my daughter is going to make me more proud than Indira Gandhi made her father. So for me, it was like it's normal for daughters to go on to succeed. And then Indira Gandhi was there, and she was a very powerful leader. Mrs. Bandaranaike had been there in Sri Lanka, the first woman prime minister. Then, of course, we had Fatma Jinnah, who was also a presidential candidate, unsuccessful, but a presidential candidate. So I grew up in a region full of powerful women, and I thought, well, if they can do it, I can do it too. But when I used to talk to others, they'd say, you're mad. How can a woman succeed? Not necessarily in politics, but I wanted to be a diplomat. I wanted to have run newspaper. I wanted to do things. And other people, men and women, would find that very surprising. So others doubted it. Even my own husband, when he married me, he thought I was under delusions that I could beat a military dictator. And he thought that when she wakes up and finds out that it's all wrong and she can't, then I'll be there to console her. Little knowing that I was the one who had to console him when I won. My father would say, my daughter will make me more proud. I always felt that I could become prime minister if I wanted to. I had a faith in myself. But at that stage, I didn't want to because I'd seen the assassination attempts on my father. I'd seen the assassination of Sheikh Mujib in Bangladesh, or maybe there was just some kind of a subconscious fear of what politics could bring. So I didn't want to do it. I didn't want the fear, the worries. His execution changed that because I felt I just couldn't let his blood and the blood of all those others who had died, because the dictator hanged so many people who were supportive of him, and they were coming on the streets to have him freed, and he'd have them whiplashed or hanged. And I thought they all did so much, and he did so much. And how can we let the dictator win and let all this blood go waste? So it was really at that time a sense of vindicating them rather than having my own agenda. I did believe in democracy, but later on I developed an independent agenda of my own. For me, idealism has been the motivation. I think power for itself is useless. If it was just power, how could one, politics is an obsession. You can't just be in politics, or if you really want something, it's not an 8 to 5 job. It's a round the clock job. So if it's just power, I think it would be very empty. I think idealism is very important, the need to change, to bring about change. I feel that life is like, or society is like a canvas, and that if you get office, you're given an opportunity to paint it. And it's up to you whether you make a good picture, whether you make a bad picture. And I think it's very, very important to have ideals. Because when one has ideals, one thinks the suffering is worth it. And for me, the suffering has been worth it because I think I could change things. And I'm still idealistic and I'm still optimistic. And people tell me, why are you still idealistic and optimistic? And I say, because there could be 10 people who are bad, but there are 90 people who are good. You do have to be practical a bit. So there are times when you make compromises, not because you want to, but that's how the political mathematics plays out. So, there have been times when we've been forced into coalitions and we've been unable to do the things we wanted to because of other coalition powers. But it's a game of mathematics and a sum, that how much are you gaining, how much can you do, and how much are you losing? So you put those down and you look at it and you say, well, okay, the gains are so much. So for that, if this is the price that has to be paid, let's pay it. When I look back on my life, I really think of the different stages when we were so raw and naive and little realized how things were. I think back to the time when my father was in prison and there were hardliners. They rejected compromise. There was a lot of pressure on the military dictator, but we just weren't ready to compromise. So I think maybe now I would look at it differently. I think back to my first tenure as prime minister, when I didn't get on with the president because he wanted to have a kind of presidential system and I believed in the parliamentary system. But then I remember that my own president, who was from my party, amount of power I gave him, and he treated me so shabbily. And I think if I'd treated the first president with given him half the powers that I gave my own president, maybe he wouldn't have knocked us out and democracy could have taken stronger roots. So, in those terms, I really look back on it. I look back also to little things like there used to be a South Asian Association regional a conference, and I was supposed to go to New Delhi. And I didn't go because somebody told me, oh, let the president go, he's from the Punjab. And if he has some agreement, it will be more acceptable. But now I realize that maybe he was unable to do it because he came from a more militaristic background than I did. So there are even little things or big things, you look back and you say, well, I wish I had done that a different way. You learn it differently. Even much more critical to my own life was my failure to understand the world is moving towards transparency. I had lived through this era of military dictatorship when the press would write all sorts of things and it would be water off the duck's back. Now I say that when there were these demands, why didn't I did say make an information act, but didn't follow it through. So I wish I'd given more freedom of information. I wish I had tackled the so-called corruption issues more deeply. It was a precedent, we all knew kickbacks must be taken, not personally, but on the level that, well, these things happen. And it wasn't like, well, we're here to change it. It was like, this is how business is done. So in retrospect, I think that I really would have done many things, many, many, many things differently. But then you learn from your own experiences. Like somebody told me, and I'm going to be using this in my speech, that, how do you succeed? And they say right decisions. Or how do you come through the right decisions? Well, through experience. And how do you get experience? Through wrong decisions. So you've got to one does make wrong. I mean, in retrospect, one is older and wiser. You have to keep going and keep in touch with people. Power is such a strange phenomena that one gets isolated from the real world. People can't see you. They can't phone you. They have to go through the operator, and it's up to the operator who he puts through. They can't write you because the secretary is going to read the letters and decide which ones are going to come to you. And in countries like mine, where there is less of democracy for so many decades and people are less literate or very few have been educated overseas, the ability to decide what is important for the other person is missing, and it's more an ability of who they want to please. This is quite frustrating for me because I've had exposure to the other world and I understand that it has to be done differently. So really one becomes a prisoner. And I used to meet my party people, I used to meet poor people in the villages, and they were all very happy because we were doing poverty alleviation and so on. But the people in the urban middle classes were very unhappy. And I realize now that I should have been out more meeting people who weren't with us or meeting people who were the representatives of organized groups. The other thing I learned, in the past when I used to meet people, I used to want to tell them what we were doing. Now I've realized that you have to listen to people and what they're saying we ought to be doing, because that's the feedback. And you know what he was saying last night, the Prime Minister of Ireland at the Academy dinner speech? He said that even if you have an idea, let the other person think it's their idea. And he was so right. So these are the sort of things, each time one is in trouble or hits rock bottom, it's a time for reflection. It's very important when one is at the bottom to reflect. And I think being able to climb back depends very much on the ability to reflect and see how the world has changed, because it's going to go on changing. I've left it to the Lord to decide which is the best path for me, while myself seeking high office. This is because I learned in 2 decades that you can shape the direction of your society by being in power or even being outside power. So for the first time, I realized you don't have to be prime minister to dominate the debate. So I thought it's better for me to concentrate on the party and build the party as an institution. Otherwise, we never have the time. We're always being hounded or we're governing. So somebody needs to take time out when the party is governing to organize the party. So I said, let somebody else be the prime minister. My party didn't agree to it. They said, we want you. And now as the situation is spiraling out of control, more and more people are saying that you're the only national figure. You've got a team, you've got the experience, and you've got a program. So we need you. But it's, with me, ambiguous, because while people want me, They have reservations, even if they may be founded well or founded wrong, but they have reservations about the role of my husband. So for me, it's very difficult because I know that when I was in government, my husband used to deal with all the traditional politicians, and he was a great help to me. And now I say the crisis is bigger, and people expect me to overcome the bigger crisis. And I have that apprehension, how will I do it if he's not there to be dealing with some of the tribal lords and people who are in parliament? You can't wish them away. So I have that sort of hesitation. And then the second thing is, on a more personal level, I feel that of the 12 years I've been married, my husband has been behind bars for 7. So I say, how is it life? Again, we are in politics and the children don't have the mother or the father. My son is now 12. The next 5 years, he'll be 17 and go off to college and then get a job and get married and have his own home. So I have these ambiguous feelings that is it right or not. But I've always had a strong sense of duty. So I feel that I ought to go and put myself forward as a candidate, which my party's endorsed me for, of Prime Minister. But whether that happens or not, I really leave it to the Lord, saying whatever's best for me and best for my country. If my children go into politics, again, very ambiguous, because I don't want them to go through what I went through. As a mother, I want to protect them from the tragedies that I have seen in my life. But I find that they are growing up in a political home. They see politicians all the time. So for them, being in politics is natural. And they play games about who's going to be prime minister. And I tell them, wait a minute. First, you've got to get a job and you've got to get a profession. You can't even think about politics without having a law degree or a medicine degree or an engineer, some degree. So I temper their enthusiasm because I think the world is changing. And I think that in the new global century that we are witnessing, you can have a career and without being in government, through NGOs and community self-service, there's a great deal that can be done. Ethnic and religious violence. I think that as the nation states begin to become weaker because of the force of globalization, there'll be a greater reversion to ethnicity and to religious violence. And I fear that there's a international community lacks a mechanism for dealing with conflict prevention or being in a position to end the conflict. Because everyone's looking towards America, and the American people have their own problems. They can be there where there's a strategic concern, but they can't be there everywhere. And so there is a lack of the growth of perhaps regional institutions that could deal with problems that were related to regional violence and leaving the global problems or the strategic problems to the more global powers. So when I get a fear, I fear the 21st century could witness a period of contradiction where there is the greatest era of peace, the superpower rivalry having gone, but there is a lot of localized violence. My hope is really for a world of peace, a world of peace that provides people opportunities to prosper, because each individual is given life once to lead, and each individual deserves a chance to succeed, especially if they're prepared to work hard and to succeed. So people need peace and they need opportunity in Pakistan and everywhere else. And that's the world I'd like to see.